The lymphatic system. Once you thought that you were done with all the vessels, here comes another wonderful little system that you're going to have to memorize a couple more things. Now, it's not going to be as intense as the blood vessels and the names of those and all that stuff. So don't feel like you're completely decimated and sorrowful. It's going to be okay. We're going to get through this. This first portion, we're going to need to talk about. I'm going to go ahead and point out a few of these things that you really should focus on. So first off, we have organs. We have ourselves some major landmarks. And then we got some lymph nodes that are more of, and those regions that are kind of more of an FYI. Also, one thing that I should point out is there's some tissue-related lymphatic systems. So they're not all by themselves. You'll notice that there's some lymphatic follicles, they're calling it here, in the intestines, in the mesentery, and all that stuff that we're going to be talking about in a little while. But let's go ahead and take this piece by piece. Let's go ahead and head to the organs first. We got ourselves some primary and secondary organs going on here. We got ourselves the thymus. The thymus is huge and important in the training of T lymphocytes, which we'll be talking about here in a little while. T cells, T lymphocytes, that's just a really fancy way of talking about a particular cell that's a huge player in your immune system. This is where they're going to grow up and become mature. The spleen is a major organ that we'll be talking about in a little while, and it's histological. Remember what it looks like. Histological looks. And then the red bone marrow, hopefully y'all remember from AMP1, is as well as the blood chapter, that a lot of the cells that float around in the blood are developed here in the red bone marrow. Your white blood cells, your red blood cells, platelets, things like that. So it makes sense that in the lymphatic system that they would include this. That indeed it has a major role in the immune system, aka lymphatic. The major landmarks that we do need to take into account is the thoracic duct, the cisternae chyli, and you'll notice that the thoracic duct pretty much just goes through, well, the thoracic cavity, hence the thoracic duct. And the cisternae chyli is sort of like the root of a cypress tree. Those of you here in NOLA know, and in Louisiana are really well aware of that and what it looks like. We'll go ahead and take a closer look at that here in a little while. We also have more of a FYI, like your lymph nodes are found throughout your body, but there are some heavy concentrations of them in specific locations. You'll notice some in the inguinal region. You'll notice some in your armpit, the axillary nodes. You'll see some in your cervical. You'll see them in the submandibular. You would see a couple more in a couple of the joints too, but we're not going to go into too much detail on those. Those are the ones that we care about for now. They are the ones highlighted in blue. There are several kind of things going on with the lymphatics, kind of like what we saw with the venous return in the heart. But this one, you'll see that it sort of starts off with the lymphatic capillaries, and it has a similar buildup and makeup as that of the vein, but some differences which we will talk about. If you remember back in chapter 21, we were talking about the mean atrial pressure and then the filtration rate of the capillaries and blah, blah, blah. You'll remember that some of it, that liquid doesn't really make it back in. There is more liquid going into the tissue than it is going back into the heart. Where is that going? Why aren't we swelling up like balloons? Why don't we see edema all the time? Well, it's because the lymphatic capillaries take up that extra slack. There are lymphatic capillaries found throughout the entirety of your body, intermeshed with the capillaries, intermeshed with the tissues, and they will pick up a lot of different things because they are a lot more holy than that of the capillaries. This is almost like a sinusoid capillary. A lot of things can sneak into it. Foreign materials, foreign cells, foreign toxins, all that stuff. Even cancer cells will sneak into this before it'll try and sneak into the blood. And that's really the reason why we look at the lymph nodes. That's why certain people look at these lymphatic tissues, this lymphatic system, before we're going into it. I mentioned lymph nodes. We should go ahead and dive into that really quick. Lymph nodes, it goes from lymphatic capillaries to lymphatic vessels to lymph nodes to the efferent vessels. Now, those of you that remember back in A&P2 might remember that afferent and efferent nerves. The afferent nerves were going to the brain. The efferent nerves were going away from the brain. This is somewhat the same setup. You got afferent lymphatic vessels going to a lymph node, while the efferent lymphatic vessels are going away from that lymph node. You will also need to point out really quick that the afferent lymphatic vessels are higher in abundance, a lot more. Most of these right here are afferent vesicles. The vessels, why am I calling it vesicles? Vessels. Well, there's maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 max of the efferent lymphatics vessels. Let's take a closer look at this right here at the lymphatic vessels really quick before we dive into this larger picture of the lymph node. You'll notice that the lymph, like I really did mention that the veins are somewhat similar to that of the lymph vessels because of how they work and how they move stuff along. Notice that the lymphatic vessels also have valves, so that way the liquid doesn't try and sneak back down. This liquid also sneaks up through your skeletal muscle, your lymphatic, your lung pump, your heart pump, and all that stuff. Kind of squishes up against these vessels and causes this liquid to kind of squirt up, just like it does in veins. Now these things squirt up, or slowly drain into this thing called a lymph node. I mentioned that a lot of foreign materials like to sneak into the lymphatic vessels, as well as a lot of that excess liquid. So it'd be really, really wise to stick on a filter before that liquid gets to the blood, and then you get something called sepsis, which is a bad thing, a very, very bad thing. Now, it sneaks in, but this is the TSA. This is like the TSA making certain that everything is, whoever's entering into the body is supposed to be in the body, or we want in the body. For instance, cancer is going to sneak in, and T cells, B cells, macrophages might recognize it, might not, who knows. Then you got the toxins. Toxins are going to get eaten up. B cells, T cells are going to maybe recognize or get activated by foreign materials that we may or may not have seen before. We'll talk more about that in another video. But it really is just amazing that how this works. The liquid sneaks into these little trabeculae, these trabecular sinuses. If you remember back in A&P1 when we were talking about tissue types, this is like a connective tissue, the reticular connective tissue, that has created like little sinuses for this liquid to go through. And as it's going through, you can see that it's in the cortex. It has T cells, it has dendritic cells, which is a type of macrophage. You also get the literal macrophage hanging out in the sinusoids. You also have some B cells hanging out in these purple dots. They sneak past this, and these things are all getting a chance to see if they recognize this or not. You get into the medulla. So cortex is just a rule of thumb, by the way. If you're ever talking about any type of organ that's shaped like this, or looks like this, or has some type of tissue consistency like this, there's a cortex and a medulla. The medulla is usually deeper. Cortex is usually on the outside. So the liquid is sneaking in, it's seeping past all these different things. The macrophages will detect whatever's foreign. B cells will detect a very specific thing and activate. And then after it's gone through the check and everything's a-okay, it's going to go into these efferent lymphatic vessels, and away it goes. Some things to point out really quick is these little purple dots right here. These are called germinal centers. These germinal centers are amazing. They're wonderful. What's going on in these germinal centers is, if you've ever had a sickness or an ailment or something like that, these B cells, these T cells that have reacted to that thing, set up little homes pretty much. And these are kind of these germinal cells, these secondary lymphatic nodules. That way, if that thing pops by again, these guys have been trained to take them out, and they take them out quick. This also explains why vaccines work so well, is because of these little trained T cells, B cells, which we'll talk about in a little while. A lot more in detail in another video. So, question is now, when somebody is discovered to have some type of metastasis, metastasis is a really fancy word of saying that some type of cancerous cell or some type of malignant tumor or what have you, the doctor will then go ahead and remove lymph nodes just above that area. So for instance, if you got an uh-oh or a boo-boo or some type of cancer in your upper right arm, they're gonna go for lymphatic vessels or lymph nodes in your armpit. If you got breast cancer, they're going to go for lymphatic vessels, or these not lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes in your axillary region. Why? Well, it's that filtration thing again. Remember that trabeculae, that liquid, and the lymphatic vessels are there picking up those larger than life things, those cells, those bacteria, those viruses, those toxins. And it's bringing it into this lymph node, and the lymph node is going, this isn't right. This is okay. That type of thing. Well, those cancerous cells might slip on by and decide, hey, this is a really, really nice place to hang out. So this is from Morimoto et al., 2014. This is a fibrous cancer lymph node. And you'll see that this is a nice healthy purple. There are some lymph nodes. There's the lymphatic follicles, the lymph nodules, the germinal centers, all that stuff. Well, look here. These things are being overcrowded by these fibrous cancerous tissues. They are crowding them out. That's what cancer does, is it just overtakes a tissue so that that tissue can no longer function. We can look at another one. This is an adenocarcinoma. What's going on? Adeno is just a really fancy way of saying like a glandular carcinoma or a gland-based cancer. It's developed from some type of gland. And these cells of the glands are now trying to make home in this lymph tissue. You can see that there's the simple cuboidal epithelial cells going on here that are characteristic of a lot of different types of glands. And they've made a lumen where they're going to try and secrete their stuff out. They're trying to do their job, but their control for cell growth and division has been overtaken and overridden, and they're just growing as fast as they can. They've metastasized accidentally. Metastasized means that it's left its original tissue, and it's starting to might just lodge somewhere, and it's decided to lodge here in this lymph node. You also have an adenocarcinoma. This is from a mammary tissue, and this is from Yale Histology. You'll notice that there's the trabeculae, there's the germinal centers, the lymphatic nodules and all that stuff. And they have formed, again, this cancerous tissue has formed little lumens to try and secrete stuff out that mammary tissue is doing. And this is the reason why we do those lymph node checks. We biopsy those lymph nodes to go ahead and see if that cancer has spread. If it's spread and it's in the lymphatic tissue, then it's has made home here, but may most likely be making a home somewhere else. So those are the three different cancers all next to each other. And with that, let's go ahead. Oh, one last thing about this. Some of you might have thought, wait a minute, hold on a sec. If they're taking lymph nodes, then what's happening to the stuff downstream? What's happening to the tissues downstream? Well, that's a really, really good question. What's happening is you have just put pretty much a pile of dirt into a giant canal. You have blocked off, I shouldn't say a pile of dirt, you have blocked off a canal. If you're in NOLA, New Orleans, then you know that There's those giant canals. Can you imagine somebody throwing a giant pile of that down on Napoleon Boulevard or something like that and just blocks it? What would happen to that liquid? Well, it would back up, and eventually it's going to back up and go over and seep into the streets, and that's not a good thing. That's exactly what's happening in here. You take a lymph node, you block off some of that lymphatic vessel, that lymphatic pathway, and liquids start backing up. You start getting swelling, you might get some edema, and it's not a very comfortable thing. So with that, I think that is a good stopping point for that. Actually, let's continue on. I'm lying. We're going to continue going. So we got the lymph node, we got the efferent lymphatic vessel. We're going to go ahead and follow that stuff out now. It's gone past the checkpoint. TSA says, okay, you're good to go. Let's let you go and fly. And it's going to get inserted into the blood. But where into the blood? So it's going to go lymphatic vessel, it's going to go lymphatic duct, and then finally into that subclavian vein. Another thing that this diagram isn't really pointing out, though, is that it can also join into that jugular vein. So remember this, that I highlighted these major ducts. These are the things that you also need to pay attention to here. Now we can actually see a little bit closer that cisterna chyli, that thoracic duct and all that. It's kind of like a cypress tree, and that cisterna chyli looks like the roots, or at least the base of that tree where it gets really, really wide. Cisterna chyli is a huge landmark for surgeons. It's that back there on the back of that spinal cord, or those vertebrae, around the thoracic region, and you can tell exactly where you are based on that. It might vary from individual to individual, but it's pretty much within that region. One thing to note is that these roots of the cisterna chyli, everything files into it. That spleen, the lower limbs, the intestines, all that seeps into the thoracic duct via the cisterna chyli. So your lower limbs, your intestines, and your spleen all feed into this place. Something to note also, after it fills into that cisterna chyli, it goes up into that thoracic duct, and eventually that thoracic duct is going to go ahead and merge into that subclavian or jugular. You'll also notice here, this left arm here is getting drained into the same place. So is the left portion of the head. So the entirety of, if you look at this lady over here, this is like an important lady to look at, by the way. That green section tells you that all that lymphatic tissue, all that lymph is like the liquid that's inside the lymphatic vessels, etc., etc. That lymph is all draining into that left subclavian. So the limbs, the digestive tract, the left arm, the left face, all drain into that left subclavian / jugular region. While that right side, the right arm, the right portion of your head, all drain into that right subclavian / jugular. Again, I put these slides up twice to really, really emphasize the importance of this. And it's really crazy that all of this goes into that subclavian, into that left subclavian. The entirety of the left side of the body, as well as the entirety of everything below that diaphragm, it looks like, feeds its lymph into that left subclavian. Something else to note about this is the lymph between the difference in appearance between the lymph here, the right side, and here from the thoracic duct is quite different. Here's the reason why. Your digestive tract, when you are absorbing fat, will only get absorbed and put into your lymphatic tissue. Fat is only absorbed via the lacteals that are embedded into your digestive system. We'll talk about that more in AMP4. But that fat can only go into your blood circulation via the lymphatic system. So you're going to get more of a milky, yellowish, white type of stuff going into your lymph nodes through the thoracic duct. While the stuff on the right side, well, it's more of a clearish liquid that you would expect with a serum almost kind of like you'd see in, not quite, you'd see as separated out plasma from blood, but something quite similar to it. Nice, clear, viscous solution. To point out one last thing, then we'll get into the other bits and pieces, is the intestines also have lymphatic tissues associated with them. And a lot of different things also have these lymphatic nodules associated with them. They're not organs themselves, but they're incorporated into the organ. This is a cross section of the ileum. It's just another part of the small intestine. And you'll see these like dark purple Peyer's patches, which have very similar patching or white blood cells, TSA type of thing going on. TSA, by the way, again, is that I'm referring to it as the airport security. They are there to help regulate and make certain that the bacteria in your guts aren't sneaking into this beyond the tissue that they're supposed to be. This is a mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. And the word for this small intestine, these nodules here, are called Peyer's patches, by the way. Peyer's patches. I've decided that we're going to go ahead and just call this entire portion of the lymphatic tissue. We're going to go ahead and dive into the primary lymph organs from here. Starting off with the thymus. Thymus is really, really basic in its description for us for now. The thymus is where T cells mature. T cells grow up and say, someday I want to be a T cell in the bone marrow. And the bone marrow says, that's great. But if you want to be a T cell, you need to go to the thymus to learn how to be one. You can't just grow up like B cell here in bone marrow. B cell equals bone. Huh, neat that they started off with a B. And T cells start with, and thymus both start with T. That's kind of cool that they named it that way. I digress. So that thymus is there to help mature these T cells. And these T cells have a really, really important job. They got to make certain that they're identifying the right stuff. They can't self-identify. They can't say this macrophage here is an invader or this red blood cell here is an invader. Because then if that's the case, you kick in this giant cascade that's targeting these red blood cells, and that's not going to end well at all. Or that a lot of the autoimmune diseases are kind of the T cells or B cells screwing up and attacking the wrong things. So your thymus is there to make certain that that doesn't happen. 90 to 92% of the T cells that get sent there to grow up do not leave, meaning they are destroyed because they screw up. Now, there are a couple of bits and pieces to histology that we do need to look at. Look at all these purple things. They're pretty much all T cells, but the two things that we should look at is the epithelial cells and the thymic corpuscle. The epithelial cells are there to help train and teach, while the thymic is there to help teach too, but also check to make certain that these things aren't doing the wrong thing or aren't performing the wrong thing. And if they are, then they're going to detonate those T cells, make them die. We also got ourselves the spleen. Spleen is extremely vascular, meaning that it has a lot of blood running through it. And it's an amazing lymphatic tissue. You may remember back from chapter 19 that spleen is sort of the sorting place to make certain that red blood cells that are worn and torn down are completely destroyed and not seeping their contents in places that you don't want them to seep out their contents. They're clearing out those red blood cells. But the spleen is also there to check. That's sort of what that red pulp is there to help make certain that's the case. The white pulp also does that too. You'll see that it's surrounded by that central artery, but that red pulp really does check and make certain that those red blood cells are doing okay or not doing okay. The white pulp, if you remember back to the lymph nodes, they had that germinal center. You kind of can see that germinal center here. That white pulp is checking your blood to make certain that you don't have anything going on in your blood, and is going to attack and fight there too. With that, that is pretty much it for the lymphatic tissues in general. We're going to be discussing in the next video, as well as in week 6, more about the details of how the immune system works. What do these cells do? What do everything do? If you get the slides, don't watch this until week 5. There's a reason why I put in this weird little video from Epic and PC Man, the Viva La Dirt League. Good video, fun little video. If you play video games, this would make you laugh. But other than that, I will see you all again soon.